Hi guys, now that E3 stuff is mostly done, I might do a recap. Maybe that'll be my Patreon video this week. Um, but yes, Patreon, you know the drill. Help support this channel. Become a monthly patron, patreon.com/LanaK. Um, I want to get back to sort of regular business for a bit before I have to knuckle down with Lady Bits. And some other stuff. This May was busy. June's going to be busy. It's summer. It gets busy. But I wanted to talk about this Steam store deal and why I have such a different opinion than the majority. I think this is an instance where the majority is wrong on this point. And more on that in a bit. I want to deal with what are you actually talking about, Leanna, for people who don't follow this stuff. Steam is, of course, the largest online retailer of digitally distributed video games, meaning they market products from around the world and therefore have products from countries with decidedly different modesty, decency, and sort of what is appropriate to say and do and show in public. Different standards for that than North America does. I mean, Canada has different standards than the US. It's so strange to me that in America, they claim to be this bastion of free speech, but you can't show as much nudity on television as you can in Canada. It's one of these examples of free speech in theory, or free expression in theory, versus actual practical what you can and can't do in certain areas of discourse. We can actually do a lot more regarding sex, sexuality, and nudity up here in Canada because we have community standards guidelines. So the minute you could be topless in public on the street in a non-sexualized manner, it was something they brought in because of breastfeeding. The minute you could do that, you can do it on television. Now they prefer you do it post 11 o'clock, what we call the watershed hour. But it is no longer censorious in that regard. We do have hate speech laws that the United States does not. And that's just, we're both Western countries, right? The British have very different laws than we do. But you get to Japan and the social norms are totally different. Sexualized content for teenagers is considered no problem. But the violence is significantly toned down. The Japanese have very different tastes and social norms than we do. And so the big question for Steam is whether it, as an American company with American sensibilities, has the practical right to essentially enforce cultural norms on games from around the world because it is so big. And that's not the way the question is being presented. The question is being presented of should Steam regulate hate speech, etc., etc. But that's not really what the question was. And unfortunately, the statement from an executive at Steam didn't actually state the question. He just says, who gets to be on the Steam store? And you can read this whole thing if you want. It was a big lead up because they knew, I think, that the decision would be very unpopular with a certain portion who happens to have access to the games press. So they really tried to explain it, but nothing was going to appease certain people unless they got their way. And, they're saying we're grappling with a really hard problem. The space is not automated. Things like this, saying the harsh reality of the space that lies at the root of our dilemma is that there's absolutely no way we can navigate it without making some of our players really mad. And then they talk about how they're not a small company, they're not homogenous. They talk about the fact what's considered acceptable discussion behavior, imagery varies significantly around the world, socially and legally. And so they said So we ended up going back to one of the principles in the forefront of our minds when we started Steam. And more recently, as we worked on Steam Direct to open up the store to many more developers, Valve shouldn't be the ones deciding this. If you're a player, we shouldn't be choosing for you what content you can and can't buy. If you're a developer, we shouldn't be choosing what content you're allowed to create. Those choices should be yours to make. Our role should be to provide systems and tools to support your efforts to make these choices for yourself and to help you do it in a way that makes you feel comfortable. With that principle in mind, we've decided that the right approach is to allow everything onto the Steam store except for things that we decide are illegal or straight up trolling. So that was the thing that got everybody mad. Basically, they're going to allow hate speech, pornography, things like that on the Steam store. Now, to be absolutely clear, Steam is a private business. They are not a government. They made this decision. I agree with it. If they were to decide to make a very different decision, I mean, GOG, for instance, curates more directly, that would be their right too. They're a private business. Now, I want to tell you why I agree with this, because Steam is not making shoes. They're not selling coffee. They're not doing shirts. They're not selling toilets or furniture or food. They are distributing art. And do we want a corporate entity deciding what art we are allowed to consume? Most people would say no. Freedom of expression, freedom of artistic expression is extremely important. But in this day and age where people have been born into more freedom than they really appreciate, they don't realize what it feels like to actually not have that ability. They believe they have been oppressed because someone has made them feel bad. But being made to feel bad is not the same as being no platformed or forced to shut up. And people who have experienced, in actuality, being forced to shut up feel very strongly that no one should have their right to expression, especially artistic expression, taken away. And my experience with this was doing AIDS awareness and gay rights work in the 1990s. Back then, it wasn't that long ago, but back then, discussions of gay sex was considered obscene. There was still much more Christian religious influence in the public sphere. Schools still had prayers in them where I was, and how do I put this? It was considered too offensive to teach someone how to put on a condom. And so we were trying to stop the spread of a disease, and we're told that was obscene. We were trying to save lives because, you know, the drugs weren't, well, you know what AIDS was like in the 90s. But it was the same thing with trying to advocate for acceptance of gay people, that there were still sodomy laws on the books back then in a lot of places. And so it was describing what was technically an illegal behavior. And therefore it was considered obscene, and you know, from a public health, from a real on the ground social justice perspective, harm reduction is a very real thing. You do what you can with what you have, instead of, you know, aiming for perfect and not being able to do anything because nothing's gonna be perfect. And it was really difficult to get that public health message across because we were constantly coming up against these obscenity arguments. Now, nowadays, no one would think that advocating for gay people advocating that love is love would be considered obscene. But this was the paradigm not long ago. Tastes very much change. And I've watched the pendulum swing from this era of sexual awakening that we had to talk about what we liked and what we didn't like. And so this whole idea that, modesty and everything like that. Oh, I gave nonverbal cues. That is so different from the way the 1990s worked. And, things have changed so much in 10 years that you cannot suppress freedom of expression, not because you want, Nazis and authoritarians running around all over the place. It's precisely because you don't. And people are sacrificing progress for safety, because if we determine these things are obscene and these things are not, then everything stops. We don't move forward, because who determines what is obscene? If somebody wants to create a Christian game service, I know that there are Christian review services out there, and they want to not have any gay content or any premarital sex or anything like that. That's up to them. They can create that service, and people can decide for themselves whether they want to partake in that. If somebody wants to do a game service where they only recommend games with gay relationships in them, that's up to them. But Steam is so big that their decisions affect everyone. They cannot have an opinion on this subject because of the power they hold. And because of this, Steve is not abandoning its principles. It is just deciding to err on the side of one set of principles as opposed to another set of principles. And I fundamentally disagree that Steam allowing something on its platform is an implied endorsement of something. There is no such thing as an implied endorsement. Endorsements are things that must be given. And the lack of an endorsement can be telling sometimes. But there is no such thing as an implied endorsement. Either you I approve this message, or you don't say it. Endorsement has to be given. There are some challenges that are going to come up. Primarily the potential for a huge inflow of crap. I don't think this decision is Steam abdicating its right to insist on a certain level of quality from games. They're not claiming that. There's not, contrary to what some people are saying, going to be a whole bunch of child porn on Steam now. That distribution of child pornography is still illegal. That's what they're talking about. Now, that doesn't mean there isn't going to be a story about somebody who may have been a trafficked child or may have been a victim of child pornography. I think that is a very relevant story that somebody may want to tell someday. And I think they should be able to do that in an interactive environment to get it, to get it, out there, to get it told. And the reason I point out that Steam is not, it's not a supermarket, it's not Walmart. Could you imagine if your local movie theater decided they weren't going to run, say, The Lord of the Rings because it had witchcraft in it? Or if they were not going to run The Passion of the Christ because it's Christian and they're an atheist? Could you imagine if someone, people got upset over those women-only screenings, single screenings of Wonder Woman? people would see that for what it was, which is the chain that is supposed to distribute art, which challenges, and you may or may not personally agree with that. They would see that as imposing their values on an audience, and that is not their place. Now, Steam is the same way. There are certain games that I don't know why anyone would want to play it. I don't know why anyone would want to, why anyone would find that fun. Some games that I don't personally find fun, I totally get why someone else would connect to it. The Grand Theft Auto series, an example of that sort of game. Some, Japanese games, I understand why I have fallen off of the Final Fantasy bandwagon. The games take too long to get going, and I don't like really long cutscenes. I understand why other people like kind of interactive movies, and they want that big experience with all the slow motion and everything like that. I'm not going to tell people that the games they like shouldn't exist just because I don't personally like them. And offense is the same way. Some people find the idea that there are more than two genders, or that some people do not feel in their hearts that they match the gender they were born with. So people consider that offensive because they believe it to be anti-science. I profoundly disagree. Then there are other people who insist that calling a trans woman, a mentally ill man in a dress is offensive. I happen to agree with that, but then the people who feel like they have the right to use those terms say, but I'm just citing science. Now, who's right? Well, I think I'm right, but can I be 100% the other viewpoint should not exist? No, because time's gonna tell. I saw with gay rights how people went from no homo, they'd actually say no homo, and that would be the end of it. You could not have a discussion with them, to where we are today in a relatively short period of time. And the only way we got there was by having the conversation. So having parts of your identity attacked hurts. It absolutely does. I understand. I know what it was like to not be allowed to speak when people I knew were dying. The sense of helplessness and unfairness that came with that, I can't describe it without getting extremely emotional. We knew the truth. We knew there was nothing wrong, nothing hellbound, nothing unnatural about gay people and loving their partners. And we knew that diseases don't discriminate, viruses don't decide they're only going to affect gay people. But at the time, some people had absolutely no sympathy for people with HIV and AIDS because they thought it was punishment from God. And we had to hear this because that was the norm. That was the majority opinion back then. And through talking and being really strong and having bad days and, closing the door and screaming and crying and breaking things just from the sheer unfairness of not being told we were wrong, being not allowed to talk about our truth. Over time, we just sort of overcame it because we were right. And the world eventually came around to our point of view. And that's why just because something hurts doesn't mean it doesn't have the right to exist. There are certain things in certain games that hurt me to partake in it, so I don't play it. Other hurts in games I actually find cathartic. I actually enjoyed the parts of Dragon Age 2 where people slut-shamed Isabella, because as someone who's gone through that myself, to see her keep her head up while all that was going on and go on and still be herself and still be, a great kind of anti-hero, a female Jack Sparrow, that was inspiring to me. And I don't want that content taken out of games because it happens in the real world, and seeing other women have to overcome that and how they overcome it, and having role models for not quitting just when somebody basically treats you like a dirty whore. That was very important for me. I needed those role models because I didn't have any in the real world. I mean, the women in my life were just, well, cover up and don't use your body as art. Just like, what do you expect? You have this coming to you. And I'm like, I'm sorry. If guys can walk around shirtless as boxers, if they're allowed to pose for calendars because they're firemen, then I am not an equal human if I am not allowed to use my body as a form of expression in the same way or other ways. And if I am truly a human being, no one determines what's okay for me. Do I feel good about this? Do I feel wrong about this? I am the only one that gets to determine that. And one of the first things that would have gone on Steam was women's rights to express ourselves in any sort of sexual manner. Because Steam was not going to discriminate between, well, a guy made this game, so it's porn. Well, a woman made this game, it's very similar content, so it's art. It would just be, this is offensive to people. It's gone. I don't want that. I think we are too Puritan right now. I think as long as we have stricter modesty standards for women than we do for men, then we are not equal. And we see that in sort of an extremist form in countries that don't have equal rights for women. They're the ones that have women covered up to like only their eyes are showing. I'm not saying there's anything wrong. I think it's actually great if a woman, I have friends who prefer to be more modest. They are more comfortable covered up. That is wonderful. That is them. That is what is right for them. I do not believe that people come out of a factory. Everybody is very different and everybody wants different kinds of attention and everybody has a different journey and what makes them feel good. If a woman, I think it's beautiful when I see a woman on the street in Canada wearing the hijab, wearing the Islamic headscarf, because I know in this country they're doing it by choice. If you start forcing modesty norms on anybody, you take away our choice to choose to be modest. So now we are no longer empowered by whatever choice we make. We're just following the herd. We're not offending. That does something to a person's mentality. Choice is powerful. One of the things I am profoundly grateful for with video games is teaching me how to choose. The reason I think I can handle the rough and tumble environment of the internet more than a lot of people can is because I became comfortable making choices with consequences. And if you coddle women for our own moral hygiene, we never learn how to do that. You cannot actually make an impact on the world if you need social permission for every single thing that you do. And wanting Steam to censor certain content based on offense is just that. Now, this is not going to change the fact that certain things are illegal in certain parts of the world. Game companies are still going to have to take that into account when they're making their games. I mean, the South Park games have absurd things. You know, they have to make different versions of the game for where different things have to be censored in different countries. If, you know, certain games are not going to be available on Steam in certain countries, that's something they can do as well. But Steam is not just telling people you're on your own. You're gonna get like Nazis and CP every day in your Steam feed. They're giving people tools to cover up the stuff that they find objectionable. And that's perfectly fine. I probably won't use them because I'm not that bothered by some of these things existing. But somebody who has been through a trauma like a school shooting should be able to avoid that crap. That is totally fair. So someone who does have a specific trigger, and the problem with triggers is they are so individual. You know, you can't predict every single actual trigger. A trigger is not something that just makes you uncomfortable. A trigger causes an intense anxiety attack or a flashback. It's instant. If you haven't had one, stop overusing the word. It's really offensive to people with PTSD. You be glad you don't have them. Like, seriously, be glad. Any person with PTSD would gladly give up their triggers. You do not like the idea that you suddenly become irrational from stimulus you can't control. So, but can I stop people from overusing the word trigger? No, I can't. Do I want people to be banned from overusing the word trigger? No, I don't. Because then they never learn the principle behind why they shouldn't do it. And this back and forth of cultural debates, cultural wars even, is the only way we sort out these questions of identity. The only way we sort out what is considered moral in our society. And if you are not challenging yourself with that material, if you are not exposing yourself to things that make you feel uncomfortable, to challenge your own perceptions of things, I hate to break it to you, you might be holding on to bigotries. Because the only way to understand the other is to be exposed to the other. And if you just hard nope at the second something may make you very uncomfortable, well, I watched people do that with gay people. The minute, you know, a couple guys held hands in the hallway, these other guys would be like, nope. And they'd say a bunch of words that are considered offensive today. Back then, it was considered a totally reasonable reaction because the offensive behavior was not calling a gay couple a whole bunch of gay slurs. It was the gay couple expressing their gayness. That's how far we've come. And that's why I don't think that things should be banned on offensiveness alone. There has to be some intent to upset someone. People should not be doing things just to upset people. They should be doing things to challenge, but not wound. It's the difference between, and I'll leave this on this example so you can kind of apply it to something in the media that happened recently. The Samantha Bee thing. Yes, she'd used the C-bomb, but there is a difference between calling your own vagina a C and calling somebody else a C. And people focused on the expletive instead of the hate behind what Samantha Bee did. In that moment, Samantha Bee was not expressing a profound disagreement with what she presumes to be Ivanka Trump's opinions on immigration. She presumed that Ivanka Trump had any power in that situation. And I don't know why anybody would think that, because I can't get my own mother to do anything I want her to do. I don't know why people think children are somehow in control of their parents. It usually works the other way around. Now, even if that's true, even if Ivanka Trump has some sort of mystical sex magic control over her dad, as Samantha Bee implied, you do not then use her motherhood and her womanhood against her. That is hate. That is not obscenity. That is hate. You are taking something she cannot control and turning it into a reason to fling verbal abuse at her. That's what's wrong with what Samantha Bee did. Not because she said a dirty word. And it's wrong because she claims to be a progressive comedian who cares about freedom and equality and issues and all that stuff. And she was, arguing for the rights of the immigrants that are being, the refugees that are being detained and separated from their families. You don't get a good thing by doing a bad thing. That is the road to hell paved with good intentions. We could not, back in the day, just go and start insulting other people because they flung gay slurs at us. We couldn't do that because they'd kick our asses. They were a lot tougher than we were. And it would have been wrong to bring up a person's race or gender or, socioeconomic condition or appearance. We had to be better. We had to show that our view of the world was truly superior to make anybody bother to change, because people don't want to go through all that work to go from one pile of shit to another pile of shit. We had to be better because we were trying to convince them that our way was better. And you can't do that by stooping to the level of a person who is communicating from a place of bigotry. So I agree with Steam's decision. There are some bridges they are going to have to cross in the future. I would have preferred that they made the decision and immediately rolled out the tools. I don't see anything here about the tools you can use. But are you asking TV shows to stop covering mass shootings because someone might be triggered? No? Well, because if you are, then half the legal procedurals on television are going to have to go bye-bye because that's what they're about. You recognize that the world goes on. You may just have to change the channel. Well, that's true of video games as well.